The morning Vera Okafor loaded 7,200 goslings into the back of her borrowed flatbed, the hatchery foreman laughed until he had to lean against the door frame to steady himself. They were runts, the whole lot of them, undersized and slow to feather, sorted from the commercial flocks as unmarketable, not worth the feed cost to bring them to slaughter weight. He had offered them to her for 11 cents apiece, which was less than the cost of the propane it would take to euthanize them, and he had done it as a kindness, he said, the way you offer a drowning person a rope made of wet paper. He did not expect her to accept. When she backed the truck to the loading dock and began counting crates, he stepped outside into the September cold and told her plainly that she was making a sorrow out of a situation that needed only to be walked away from. She said nothing. She kept counting. The foreman stood there long enough to feel the awkwardness of standing there, then went back inside, and Vera Okafor drove her 7,200 runts down a county road that most maps forgot to include, toward a piece of ground that most people had stopped thinking about, the same year her grandmother died. That question, the one the foreman could not get out of his head in the weeks after, the one that spread through the agricultural community of Carteret County the way any small story spreads through any small community, the one that became half joke and half genuine bewilderment at the Thanksgiving tables of that November, was simply this. What do you do with 7,200 geese that nobody wants? People asked it as a joke. They did not know she had already answered it. They did not know the answer had been written down 22 years before she was born, in a composition notebook with a cracked spine, by a woman named Pauline Okafor, who had spent 40 years learning a thing the industry had no column for on its spreadsheets. The answer was patient. The answer was unhurried. The answer smelled of river mud and grain dust and the particular cold of an October dawn when the fog has not yet lifted off still water. The answer, in the language Pauline had used in that notebook in her dense, careful handwriting, was this: a small thing, given what it needs and enough time, will surprise everyone who counted it small. That was the refrain Vera had grown up hearing, not as sentiment, as instruction. A small thing, given what it needs and enough time, will surprise everyone who counted it small. She had heard it the first time at age 9, sitting beside Pauline on an overturned crate, watching a litter of undersized barn cats work through a pan of warm milk. She had heard it again at age 17 when she failed her first attempt at the county 4-H poultry competition, and Pauline, instead of comforting her, pulled out the notebook and read her the full context. And she heard it a third time the night before Pauline died, in the winter of the year Vera turned 24, when the old woman pressed the notebook into her hands and said it one final time, without irony or performance, as a person states a thing they know to be simply and everlastingly true. This is the story of what Vera Okafor did with 7,200 geese that nobody wanted. It takes 3 years to tell properly. The first year is about preparation. The second year is about patience. The third year is about a winter that the Extension Service would later call, in its careful bureaucratic language, a significant regional event. What the farmers called it was more direct, but that is later. Begin at the beginning. Begin in September with a woman who does not argue, and a truck full of birds that everyone else had written off as a mistake. The ground Vera brought them to was 43 acres of low, boggy river bottom that the county assessor had valued at essentially nothing for 30 consecutive years, because essentially nothing was what anyone had ever managed to grow there at commercial scale. It was wet in places where wetness served no one, stiff with iron-heavy clay in the sections that occasionally dried, and bordered on 2 sides by the kind of scrub willow that accumulates wherever humans have stopped paying attention. It had belonged to Pauline, who had bought it cheap, who had used it quietly, and who had left it to Vera with a note attached to the deed that read only, "You know what it is for." Vera knew. She had known since she was old enough to read the notebook. The land was not a liability. It was a condition. And the geese were not runts. They were a match. Geese of the commercial varieties are bred for one metric: weight gain per feed unit, measured against a calendar that runs 14 weeks from hatch to slaughter. The birds that fall outside that metric in either direction, too slow, too small, too reluctant to overcrowd without stress losses, are removed. They are removed not because they are bad birds, but because they are wrong birds for a particular kind of production that values uniformity above all other things. Pauline had written this down in 1987 without bitterness as simple observation. She had also written in the same entry that the wrong bird for a confinement operation is often the right bird for something older and harder to name. Something that requires a bird that can forage, that can navigate uneven ground, that can weather cold without a controlled barn, that is not optimized for speed but for duration. She had written, "The slow bird and the rough land find each other eventually if someone is willing to wait." Vera had read those lines so many times they had stopped feeling like words and started feeling like a measurement she carried in her hands. She did not need to argue for them. She needed only to act on them. And so she began. The first thing she built was shelter, not confinement, but protection from wind and precipitation on the sections of ground that backed against the willow scrub. She used lumber she had spent the previous 18 months salvaging from 3 barns that had been demolished in the county, paying nothing for the wood and considerable effort for the hauling. She built low, open-fronted structures on the high margins of the property, 8 of them, each one holding 400 birds comfortably without crowding. She laid the floors with the reed and cattail she harvested from the boggy center ground, cutting it herself over the course of 10 days in August with a hand scythe her grandmother had kept sharp on a particular whetstone that was still on the shelf in the old woman's shed. She arranged the structures in a pattern that Pauline had sketched once in the notebook's back pages, showing how the prevailing wind off the river bottom would be broken before it reached the birds, how the low winter sun would reach the open fronts between 10 in the morning and 2 in the afternoon, how drainage from the upland sections would channel away rather than pool under the sleeping areas. The county extension agent came on a Tuesday in the 3rd week of October. His name was District Representative Sheldon Fitch, and he drove a clean white pickup with the agency seal on the door. And he looked at what Vera had built with an expression that cycled through several phases before settling on something that resembled concerned benevolence. He walked the rows of low structures. He looked at the birds, who were by then 4 weeks old and beginning to show their pin feathers in the gray-brown of immature geese, not particularly beautiful, not uniform in size, scattered across the near paddock in the mid-morning light. He pulled out a folder. He told Vera that the Extension Service had a preferred stocking density model for outdoor waterfowl operations and that her arrangement did not map neatly to any of the 3 recognized production systems the service had published guidance on. He told her he was concerned about disease pressure in an uncontrolled environment. He told her, in a tone of genuine and somewhat patronizing warmth, that the birds she had taken on were already compromised in their growth trajectory and that she might want to consider cutting her losses before the feed costs compounded. He said he had seen well-intentioned projects like this one cause more heartache than they resolved. Vera listened to all of it. Then she said, "They will be fine." Then she went back to work. Fitch stood in the paddock for another minute, wrote something in his folder, and drove back toward the county road. He filed a report that characterized the operation as informal subsistence scale with limited commercial viability and high welfare risk. He copied no one on it. He considered the matter closed. It was not closed. It had barely begun. Through October and into November, the geese ranged. This was the design. The 43 acres of low ground held more forage per square foot than any controlled pasture in the county, because it had not been managed to a commercial purpose for 30 years. And in 30 years of not being managed, it had become, in the way land does when left to its own logic, extraordinarily rich. The reed beds were full of invertebrates. The shallow standing water at the center of the property held aquatic vegetation that geese will work methodically for hours, pulling it up root by root in a behavior that pasture-raised birds on dry ground never develop. The scrub willow margins were full of insects through October and into the first frosts of November. Vera supplemented with a grain mix that Pauline had specified in the notebook, a ratio of oats to barley to field peas, heavier on the peas than any commercial mix, because field peas and geese produce a slower, denser muscle fiber that is not valued by an industry that wants rapid growth, but is valued enormously by anyone who is going to cook the bird. She had sourced the grain from 2 farms at the county's north end in the spring, paying in advance, which she could do because she had spent the previous 2 years working off-farm and saving with a precision that Pauline would have recognized. The neighbor to the east was a man named Carlton Pruitt, who ran 800 commercial breed geese in a covered confinement house on 20 acres of tile-drained bottomland, and who had been doing so profitably for 11 years. Carlton was not unkind. He brought Vera a casserole in November because he had heard from his wife, who had heard from the feed store, that Vera was trying to raise those hatchery runts on that old swamp ground, and he felt sorry for her. He sat in her kitchen while she moved around it, and he explained the confinement economics to her in detail, as though she had not grown up on this land, as though the notebook were not on the table between them. He said the math on outdoor ranging did not pencil out once you factored in the gain rate differential. He said the buyers he worked with required a consistent 12-pound dressed weight, and that birds raised on variable forage were variable birds, and that variable birds were a buyer's problem, which meant they became the grower's problem, which meant they became a loss. He said all of this with the casserole on the table and genuine goodwill in his voice, which made it, in the way of things, harder to hear than cruelty would have been. Vera said, "Thank you for the casserole." Then she said, "These are not 12-pound birds." Carlton looked at her. She said, "They will be 14. He looked at her the way people look at someone who has said a thing that sounds like it should be a boast, but comes out of the mouth as a fact. He picked up his dish, thanked her for the conversation, and drove home. His wife asked him what she had said. He told her. His wife said that sounded promising. Carlton said it sounded like grief talking. Pauline's notebook had a full entry on dressed weight in slow-grown outdoor geese. The entry was dated November 1991 and ran to 4 pages, which was unusual because Pauline wrote in a compressed style that rarely gave a single subject more than a page. She had raised a trial cohort of 63 runts on the same 43 acres in the fall of that year, ranging them on the same forage, the same grain mix, the same wind-breaking structures on the high margins. She had processed them herself in January, after 18 weeks on range instead of the commercial 14. The average dressed weight was 13 pounds 11 ounces. She had written the number twice, as Vera now wrote it in her own margin notes when she reread the entry. 13 pounds 11 ounces from a bird the hatchery would have euthanized for 11 cents. She had also written, in the entry's final paragraph, a note that Vera had underlined before she was old enough to fully understand it. The customer who wants a 14-pound goose for a Christmas table will pay whatever you ask, because a goose that size and quality does not exist in the commercial market, and they know it, and you know it, and that is the only conversation that needs to happen. Vera was not ready to have that conversation in the first year. The first year was about the birds and the ground. She spent the winter of year 1 processing 200 of the 7,200, selecting the birds that had reached full growth earliest, and selling them locally at farmers' markets and through 2 restaurant contacts she had made over the preceding years. She priced them at what Pauline's entry had suggested, a price that made the buyer pause for 1 full second before they nodded. Every one of them sold. She kept careful records in a ledger she had bought for this purpose, not because she distrusted her memory, but because Pauline had kept records, and because records, as Pauline had written in the notebook's opening pages, are the memory of the land when the person who held the knowledge is gone. She reinvested everything. She bought a second-hand commercial plucking drum because processing 200 birds by hand had taken 2 weeks, and she could not lose that time again. She repaired the fencing on the property's river boundary, where the spring floods of the previous 2 years had taken posts. She planted 2 additional acres of field pea at the property's upper edge to increase the forage supplement supply. She inoculated the boggy center section with watercress plugs, following an instruction in Pauline's notebook that she had not fully understood until she watched the geese work the existing aquatic vegetation and understood what the water could produce if it was managed rather than ignored. She filed the appropriate permits with the state agricultural department because she intended to scale, and scaling required paperwork, and the paperwork required knowing what you were doing, which she did. The second year began in March with a new delivery from the same hatchery. She had called in January. The foreman had laughed again, more briefly this time, and had named a price of 9 cents per runt because the new cohort's culling rate had been high, and the inventory of undersized birds was even larger than the prior year. He offered her 5,000. She said she would take 8,000. He was quiet for a moment. She could hear him working out whether she was serious. She was serious. They agreed on a number, and she drove back to the hatchery in March with the borrowed flatbed and a second trailer she had arranged through Carlton Pruitt's cousin, who did not know why she needed it and did not ask. 8,000 more goslings on 43 acres of river bottom, plus the 3,000 adults remaining from the previous cohort's non-processed birds, which she was keeping as a foundation breeding stock. Total birds on the property in the spring of the second year, 11,000. Fitch, the extension agent, drove out in April and stood at the property gate for a long time before getting out of his truck. He did not come in. He wrote in his folder. He left. 2 weeks later, Vera received a form letter from the Extension Service suggesting that her operation might benefit from a consultation on biosecurity protocols for high-density outdoor systems. She filed it. She did not call. It was in the second year that Milo Asante appeared. He was 22 years old and had grown up in the next county and had spent 1 year at the agricultural college before the tuition money ran out. And he had heard about the woman with the swamp geese the way young people hear about things that don't fit any category they have been taught. He came on a Saturday morning in May, parked his car at the gate, and stood there until Vera came out to meet him. He said he had heard she was doing something different. She looked at him. He said, "I can work. I am not afraid of early mornings or water." She studied him for a moment and then said, "Boots?" He looked down at his feet. He was wearing work boots. She opened the gate. That was the entire interview. He was still there at the end of the second year and the third, and he would still be there, as anyone who knows the story knows, long after the story's crisis had passed and become history. Milo had the quality that the notebook had attributed, in a single compressed phrase, to the best kind of help. He saw the system before he understood it, and he trusted the system before he could explain it. He watched Vera rotate the birds through the paddocks in the sequence she had mapped from Pauline's sketches, resting sections of ground before returning birds to them, preventing the overgrazing that destroys forage in unmanaged ranging systems. He understood, within 2 weeks and without being told, why the grain supplement was timed to the afternoon rather than the morning, because morning birds on full forage were moving birds, and moving birds needed to be on forage, not at the trough. He asked one good question per week. He accepted the answers without requiring them to be proven. In May of the second year, Carlton Pruitt's covered barn had a disease event. It moved through 800 confined birds over 11 days, and he lost 430 of them, which was a significant loss in any season and a potentially ruinous one in a year when feed costs had already climbed. He came to see Vera not for comfort but to borrow her plucking drum because he needed to process the surviving birds quickly before the loss deepened. She lent it without discussion. He thanked her stiffly. He looked at the geese on the river pasture, 3,000 of the previous cohort moving through the reed beds in the low morning light, unbothered, healthy, working. He did not say anything about them. He took the drum and came back with it 3 days later. When he returned it, he asked briefly what she was feeding. She told him. He nodded. He drove home. He increased his biosecurity protocol and did not have another event that season, but he did not change his system. He was not yet ready to change his system. That would come later, in the cold. The third year's summer was beautiful, which is always, in the telling of these stories, the detail worth noting. Beautiful summers are the lull. They are the season in which certainty calcifies, in which the confident become more confident because everything is going exactly as it always has, in which the long-range forecasts are consulted less often because the long-range forecast is obviously more of this. Fitch attended an agricultural extension conference in August and presented a paper on poultry production efficiency in the state's river-bottom counties. The paper contained no reference to Vera Okafor's operation. Carlton Pruitt expanded his barn by a third, taking on a bank loan that he calculated against 3 more good seasons at current dressed weight prices. A regional protein distributor whose name was Harlan Groves drove through Carteret County in July in a leased car, scouting supply chains for a new grocery contract, and stopped at Carlton's operation and shook hands and talked numbers. He did not stop at Vera's gate. Nobody pointed him there. Vera spent the summer of the 3rd year preparing. She did not know, in the way of knowing a certainty, what was coming. But Pauline's notebook had an entry, written in the winter of 1983, that Vera returned to every August the way a careful person returns to a document before making a decision. The entry was about the river. About how the river, in years when the spring flooding was early and the summer was warm and the oak galls came heavy, tended to be followed by a winter that was not polite. Pauline had observed this pattern across 4 decades. She had not claimed to understand the mechanism. She had written only, "When these 3 things appear together, be ready." All 3 things had appeared in the spring and summer of the 3rd year. The flooding had come 12 days earlier than the 5-year average. The summer was warm. The oak galls, those small brown distortions on the leaf stems that most people never think to count, had come heavy enough that Vera had noted them in her own ledger in the 3rd week of July. She noted them and began, in August, to prepare. She ordered additional grain before the fall price rise. She bought it in quantity, prepaid, from the same 2 farms at the county's north end. She increased the depth of the bedding in the wind shelter structures and added tarps along the riverside openings against lateral wind. She brought in 2 additional cord of firewood for the small propane-supplemented heating stoves she had placed in the structures for extreme cold, not because geese required supplemental heat in most cold, but because Pauline had noted that, in an exceptional cold, even waterfowl need a dry thermal anchor to maintain the body condition built over a long-ranging season. She had Milo reinforce the fencing along the river boundary a 2nd time. She moved the foundation breeding stock, the 3,000 adult birds from the original cohort, to the highest and driest paddocks on the property, leaving the lower river sections to the current year's range birds, who were younger and faster on their feet and less vulnerable to the stress that standing water in a deep freeze could create. Milo watched all of this and said one October morning, "You think it will be bad." She was moving along the fencing line with a bag of clip fasteners. She said, "Yes." He said, "How bad?" She said, "Bad enough to matter." He said nothing further. He picked up his own bag of fasteners and began working the fence from the opposite end. Fitch made his final visit of the year in October. He had received, from the state office, a directive to document any operations in river-bottom zones that might be at risk in a high-precipitation winter event, which was a category that the state's modeling office had flagged as elevated probability for the region based on atmospheric data. He was not, in truth, worried about Vera's operation. He was worried about Carlton Pruitt's barn, which sat on lower ground than its tile drainage was strictly equipped to handle in an extreme event. He drove out to check on Vera as a formality, because her property was on the list, and because visiting her made him feel, in a complex way he would not have articulated, like a responsible person. He walked the paddocks. He looked at the tarps. He looked at the additional grain in the secondary storage structure she had built that summer. He looked at the birds, who were, by this point, well into their 3rd season's growth cycle, the 8,000 second-year birds now full adults in their 2nd winter, and the original cohort's survivors in their 3rd year, a bird that had spent 3 winters on rough ground and eaten well and moved daily, a bird that was not 12 pounds but was not 14 either. Some of them were 16, and all of them were something the industry's charts did not have a number for, which is called excellent. Fitch said, "You seem prepared." She said, "I hope so." He said, "The models are showing some probability of a cold event this winter." She said she had read the same. He said, "If you need assistance, the Extension Service has a protocol for emergency livestock welfare support." She nodded. He drove away. He filed his report. The report noted that the informal river bottom waterfowl operation appeared stable and no intervention was recommended. He did not note the bird's condition. He would not have had the vocabulary to describe it precisely. The cold arrived in the second week of December, which in Carteret County was not itself unusual. A cold second week of December was a cold second week of December. What was unusual was that it did not leave. By Christmas Eve, the low temperature had not risen above 19 degrees Fahrenheit for 11 consecutive nights. The river had frozen at its edges and was moving sluggishly at its center in the way of rivers that are considering their options. The tile drainage system under Carlton Pruitt's barn field had frozen to a depth that stopped its function, and the water that the drainage was designed to carry away had nowhere to go, and the water, combined with the ice that formed in the barn's unheated margins, created the conditions that no confinement barn designed for moderate winters is built to sustain. On the 26th of December, a pipe in Carlton's water delivery system fractured. On the 27th, the backup heating element in the barn's climate control failed, and the temperature inside dropped to 31 degrees, which is the threshold below which the dense confinement population of his operation could not maintain warmth through collective body heat alone without stressing. He lost 60 birds on the 27th. He lost 112 on the 28th. Harlan Groves, the distributor who had shaken hands with Carlton in July, had a January delivery contract for 800 dressed geese to fulfill a grocery chain's holiday gift season extension program. And on the morning of December 28th, Carlton called him to say that the January delivery was going to be short. Harlan, who had spent his career in protein distribution and who knew what a short delivery in a contracted holiday program meant, drove back to Carteret County from the city in a leased car on roads that were, by the 28th, not welcoming to leased cars, and stood in Carlton's barn in a coat that was not designed for standing in a barn at 31 degrees, and looked at what remained of 800 geese in a climate-controlled operation that was not, at that moment, controlling its climate. It was Carlton who told him to drive out to the river bottom. He was not doing it as a favor to Vera. He was doing it because he was a man in a difficult position looking for options, and options were what that property represented to him now, though they had not represented anything to him in July when the summer was beautiful and the year was going as expected. He told Harlan where to turn off the county road. He said, "She has birds." He paused. He said, "They will be what you need." Harlan Groves drove out on the 28th of December on a county road that was mostly ice and found the gate unlocked and drove through and found Vera and Milo at the lower paddock doing the morning welfare check, moving along the fencing in the 19-degree air with their breath coming in long white exhalations, checking the birds. The birds were standing in the winter morning light in the thousands, dense and calm, their feathers ruffled against the cold in the way of birds that have been building toward this cold for 3 years of outdoor ranging. The wind shelters were functioning. The thermal stoves in the structures were lit. The grain had come at 3 that morning, as it did every cold morning, because in deep cold a bird at range needs its calories before anything else. Harlan stood at the paddock fence and looked at 11,000 geese on 43 acres of river bottom in 19-degree weather, calm, healthy, and extraordinary. And he was quiet for a long time before he said anything at all. He said, "How many can you process?" She looked at him. She said, "How many do you need?" He named a number. She was quiet. She looked at Milo, who was watching. She looked back at Harlan and said, "At what price?" He named a price. She said, "No." She named a different price. He looked at her for a moment, the way people look at a person who has named a price that is not an opening offer but an only offer, and then he said yes. He said yes because a 16-pound, slow-grown outdoor goose in the 3rd week of December is not a commodity. It is an object that exists in a category by itself. It is the thing the whole supply chain was failing to produce at that moment on every farm that had built for the normal winter. It is worth whatever the person who has it says it is worth, within the range of reason, and Vera had named a number within the range of reason. Harlan Groves knew this. He had spent 30 years in protein distribution, and he knew the difference between a number pulled from anger and a number pulled from knowledge. She processed 1,100 birds over 7 days, with Milo, with the plucking drum that Carlton had returned months ago, with 3 additional part-time hands she called in from the county's agricultural labor pool, paying them immediately from the advance deposit Harlan wired the afternoon of their agreement. She processed 1,100 birds and delivered them on the 3rd of January in a refrigerated truck she hired for the purpose. And every bird met the quality specification Harlan had outlined, and most of them exceeded it, because a bird that has been building on outdoor range for an 18-week minimum season does not have the faults of speed. It does not have the breast-heavy imbalance of confinement growth. It does not have the pale, water-retentive flesh of birds pushed through on a maximum gain diet. It has instead the thing Pauline had described in the notebook's final entry before her handwriting became too uncertain to continue, the thing she had called, simply, proper flavor. The flavor of time. On the 4th of January, Carlton Pruitt came to the gate. He came early, before 8, and Vera met him at the gate because she was already out. She was always already out before 8. He had his hat in his hands, which was not a gesture she had ever seen from him, and he said that he was in a difficult position and that he needed to understand how she had done what she had done with those birds in that cold. He said it without pride, which was the hardest version of saying it. She looked at him for a moment. Then she opened the gate. She brought him to the kitchen. She put the notebook on the table between them, open to the entry dated October 1991, the entry about slow birds and rough land. She let him read. He read for a long time. He turned to the next page and read that too. He asked if he could take notes. She gave him a piece of paper. He took notes. She made coffee. He looked up at one point and said, "Your grandmother knew all of this." Vera said, "She learned all of this. There is a difference." He looked back at the notebook. He finished his notes. He drank his coffee. When he left, he shook her hand, which was also not a gesture she had ever seen from him. Fitch came in February with a different folder. This one had a form in it from the State Agricultural Innovation Office, a grant program for what the form called non-conventional resilience practices in climate-variable production zones, which was the bureaucratic language for what everyone in Carteret County had spent the winter calling, more simply, what Vera did. The grant was for documentation and knowledge transfer. The state wanted the system described in enough detail to be teachable, which meant the state wanted, in essence, a version of Pauline's notebook formatted for an agency report. Vera looked at the form for a long time. Then she told Fitch she would participate on one condition, which was that the program acknowledge the original source, which was a woman named Pauline Okafor, who had done the original work over 40 years on this ground and had written it down so that it would not be lost. Fitch said he thought that could be arranged. It was arranged. The program documentation that the state office published the following spring included, on its second page, a full paragraph crediting Pauline Okafor and noting that the practices described were drawn from her observational records spanning 1981 to 2014. Milo stayed. He had nowhere he needed to be more urgently, and he had, over 3 years, learned the system well enough to teach it, which was the point. The second year after the cold winter, Vera began taking on one apprentice per season, always young, always practical, always someone who had heard about the swamp geese the way young people hear about things that don't fit any category. She showed each one the notebook first. She read them the same entry Pauline had read to her at age 17, after the failed competition, in the same flat, unperformative voice that meant, "This is not inspiration, this is instruction." A small thing, given what it needs and enough time, will surprise everyone who counted it small. In the 5th year after the cold winter, a library in the county seat received a grant to document agricultural heritage of the river bottom region, and they sent a researcher who spent 2 weeks on Vera's property and who interviewed her at length and who eventually asked her how she would summarize what she had learned. She thought about it for a while. She said, "I did not learn it. It was given to me. I tried not to waste what was given." The researcher wrote that down and then asked, "And the birds, the runts, the ones they laughed at?" Vera was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "They were never runts. They were just unmatched. There is a difference." The library installed, in the small agricultural heritage room on its second floor, a glass case that contains several things. It contains a photograph of the 43 acres taken from a small plane in the January after the cold winter, showing the birds on the snow-dusted ground in their thousands while the surrounding farms lie brown and still. It contains Carlton Pruitt's handwritten notes from the morning he sat in Vera's kitchen, which he donated himself, without being asked, because he said they were part of the record and the record deserved to be complete. It contains 3 pages photocopied from Pauline's notebook, chosen by Vera, including the entry dated November 1991 with the dressed weight written twice. And it contains a card handwritten by Vera at the library's request, asking her to state in a single sentence what the notebooks represented. She wrote, "She learned it so it would not be lost, and she made sure it was not lost, and what she knew is still here." That is the sentence on the card. That is the whole story, compressed to its core. A small thing, given what it needs and enough time, will surprise everyone who counted it small. The land remembered what the industry had forgotten. The birds were never the problem. The patience was the method. The notebook was the proof. And Vera Okafor, who had not argued with a single person who told her she was wrong, who had answered every dismissal with fewer words than the dismissal deserved, and then returned to work, stood in the library room on the day of the case's installation and looked at her grandmother's handwriting behind the glass and said nothing at all, because there was nothing left to say that the record did not already contain.